In terms of foreign policy, we left the Eisenhower administration in sort of a stalemate. They were in a stalemate because of the U-2 crisis, issues in Berlin that couldn't be resolved, or whether or not Western troops were going to be withdrawn so the Soviets could take it over. The West was having none of that. Under Kennedy, the idea is, as a young president, he wants to initially hold the line. He's part of a generation that's been tempered by war, he says, but as well, he doesn't want to be bullied and pushed around as a younger president, establishing himself, once again with the Democratic establishment, looking over their shoulder, because of McCarthyism, to this fear of being labeled as soft on communism. Kennedy's initial step, though, is probably an unmitigated disaster for him. The Central Intelligence Agency, under the Eisenhower administration, had been planning a covert operation to overthrow the government of Cuba. Fidel Castro had overthrown the government of Fulgencio Batista, which had been sympathetic to the United States, and been putting in place a Marxist or communist regime, which was pretty much counter to everything that we'd seen from the Monroe Doctrine forward about American interests in the Caribbean. So the Eisenhower administration had been brought forward to this plan to use Cuban exiles as CIA-trained forces to land at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. A couple thousand of them were then going to get the population to join in with them, who would see these people not as invaders but as liberators, and overthrow the Castro government. It was a fantastically misguided intelligence assessment by the Central Intelligence Agency, and what happens is the soldiers, the 1,600 guys who get landed by American forces in Cuba, 1,600 ex-Cubans, get really overwhelmed by Cuban regular forces and the Cuban population, which didn't have sympathy for this, and they surrendered. Kennedy refused to send in American military troops to back them up, and so Castro then uses this to consolidate his hold on power in many ways. Shaken up on the basis of this, in a position on his heels a little bit, Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, sees Kennedy as being somewhat weak and tries to push him on concessions, and in 1961 renews his demands to take Western troops out of Berlin. Kennedy refuses to do so, and in response to that, the Soviets start building for East Germans the so-called Berlin Wall, which was, in a real testament to negative advertising, was a wall that was designed not to keep outsiders out, but to keep their own people of Eastern Europe in. So in many ways, it was negative public relations for the Soviets, even as they did it. They did it in order to keep Eastern people from fleeing over to the free Western areas. Kennedy at this point does not do anything to stop this wall from being built, but he says it's going to stand as a symbol and is going to carry on in many ways some of the policies we've seen to try to deal with the Soviets in a non-confrontational manner, but a long-term manner to outlast their way of life economically with our defense spending and with our protections in place. The massive retaliation doctrines, in other words, and brinkmanship. Kennedy finds reasons to question brinkmanship after the Cuban Missile Crisis. By 1962, Castro, because of the Bay of Pigs incident, is convinced that, kind of rightfully so, the American government wants to overthrow him, or is a threat to his existence. So what he proposes to do then is he tries to get even more aid from the Soviet Union. And he gets that aid in the form of, he asks for, I want guarantees of stability, I want nuclear weapons, I want nuclear missiles on the ground in Cuba that should the Americans invade, we can launch at them as a defensive measure. The Soviets start shipping these missiles in. American U-2 spy plane flights discover this. And upon discovery of this, the United States decides that this is such a violation of our national security, going back not just to the Monroe Doctrine ideas, but the notion of missiles 90 miles off the Florida coast with nuclear warheads on them that could reach as far as Chicago, pretty much could make the entire United States vulnerable to nuclear attack within 7 to 10 minutes tops, decides that those missiles are going to be removed. Kennedy puts the nation on a major defense footing. He sends the United States Navy to quarantine, to circle around the island of Cuba and turn back any Russian freighters that come down with more missiles, and then also insists to the Russians to get the missiles they have out. It looks like we're on a track for a full-dress nuclear war at this point in time. This is the downside of massive retaliation and brinkmanship. If you bring the world right to the brink of nuclear war, you stand a risk of maybe going over the brink. And the question would be, as the Soviet freighters carrying more nuclear weapons and just supplies in general were going across the Atlantic Ocean to Cuba, what's going to happen when they get to the United States picket line? What's going to happen when they get to the line of United States vessels that are cordoning off Cuba from the outside world? Are the Soviet ships going to stop? Are they going to press on through? Are they going to turn back? we're going to have a shooting war. And there's almost no way that the shooting war over Cuba would not turn into a global conflict that involves nuclear weapons being deployed on both sides. So the world was very, very much at the brink of nuclear war. Finally, after several days of brinkmanship, intention, and essentially crisis mode on both sides, the Soviets, they blink, they back down. But there's an informal deal that's arranged. The United States promises never to invade Cuba, and in exchange, Cuba removes the Soviets remove their nuclear missiles from Cuba. The United States also promises to remove some older, more outdated nuclear missiles we had from Turkey that were pointed at the Soviet Union, but we're going to do that secretly. Castro feels kind of hung out to dry because felt he'd been sold out by the Soviets who sent the missiles packing. But for the Americans and the Soviets, this is a fantastic lesson in going right to the edge of nuclear war is a very dangerous thing because you might wind up going over the edge. So two long-lasting effects of this is the hotline, a direct link of communication between the Kremlin and the White House is established. And then you also receive the impetus from this for Kennedy and Khrushchev. They're kind of sobered up by the experience, if you will. It's a bucket of cold water in the face of nationalist and global ambitions. Both sides come to the negotiating table and sign the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which called for an end to above-ground testing of nuclear weapons, either in the atmosphere. And it's the first disarmament treaty for nuclear weapons that's established between the great powers. So you don't see a thaw in the Cold War, but you see both sides beginning to back away from this idea of this all-or-nothing approach, bringing us right to the edge of total destruction and oblivion for the planet. For Kennedy, it also leads him and his foreign policy advisors to question the legitimacy of massive retaliation and brinkmanship. And it leads them to come up with a new policy in its place, which was known as flexible response. The policy of flexible response was about using more conventional troops or special forces troops on a global basis. So as you look back at our map up here, the idea is maybe whatever action the Soviets may take globally in some region of the Third World, whether it's Africa, the subcontinent India, the Far East, the Southeastern Pacific, wherever it was going to be, or in Europe, the United States would respond appropriately. In other words, we would respond with a level of force commensurate with what was going to happen in that area. So in other words, an incursion by the Soviet Unions into a place such as Angola is not going to necessarily result in us saying, well, we're going to be ready for full-dress nuclear war now. We would counter, it almost brings us back to some Truman Doctrine things of countering with resources, with money, with finance, with troops and training. The good news is a way to counter the Soviets in a Cold War and make sure the Cold War still sort of stays cold. The downside is it does lead you back into the model of the Truman Doctrine, which can pull American troops and American aid and American assistance into all sorts of foreign lands on a gradual, drip, 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 trickling up basis, which could explain how over time you could go from a small presence to a very large presence of American military forces committed to a place like Vietnam. And we'll see this play out as we're going to rise up this ladder of escalation. Not with John Kennedy, who's going to be, as you well know, killed by presidential assassination in November of 1963, but instead with his successor, another Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson. And we'll discuss how Johnson and the ordeal of Lyndon Johnson, as we emerge through the 60s on both foreign and domestic policies, is going to bring together all sorts of themes and threads that we've seen come through in our past previous lessons about social pressures, economic pressures, foreign policy pressures, all in a tightly packed package of what the time period that you sort of call, quote unquote, the 60s really represents. We'll see that play out in our next two lessons as America enters into a period of some real internal and external turmoil.